In this video, we will be focusing on how browsers function, how they work, how HTML, the browser, you're going to learn about the DOM, which is the document object model, and JavaScript, how they all interact. And we're going to be going through this diagram that I have up on my screen. But before we get to that, let's go ahead and set up everything we're going to need for this tutorial. You should have downloaded, and if you haven't yet, make sure you go to the resources for this video and download the project or the sample project that I have. It's called DOM example. So download the domexample.zip archive and then go ahead and extract that archive to your computer, wherever it is that you're keeping all of your projects from these videos or these walkthroughs when you're coding along. Go ahead and extract that. You should have a folder called DOM example wherever it is on your computer that you open it up. All right. Once you've got that, open up Visual Studio Code, click on Open Folder, and then navigate to where it is that you opened up or where you unzipped that archived folder that contains all of our project files. And then go ahead and select the folder for DOM example, click Open, and we should now have the project opened here in the left-hand side of our Visual Studio Code. Go ahead and click on index.html. And we're going to start off by examining this HTML as well as going through this example of, or this diagram of how browsers function and how everything relates. Now, up until this point of time, in most of our videos, we have been working in a JavaScript file like this one, and we've been doing a lot of learning the basics of JavaScript. So we've gone through if statements, something like this, with an expression, and then some code that gets output right here. And as a result, we've been using a lot of console.log and then logging out info or information that we want to see that's been executed by our JavaScript environment. And we've been using the debug right here. And when we do that, we're executing this JavaScript file against our local Node.js environment. And what that does is it allows us to see the execution and output of all the JavaScript we write right here down in what we call the debug console or the terminal. And this is great when we're first learning JavaScript and we're first getting a hang for how JavaScript works, and we want to see immediate feedback on all the stuff that we're doing in JavaScript, all the output. Now, the cool thing about JavaScript is that these days we can execute it locally against our Node.js environment just like we can .NET, C#, PHP, or other programming languages. In other words, it's a full-blown programming language that we can use on our local machines and on the server, and it's just a full-blown language. But originally, JavaScript was actually built to be run in the browser. Now, to give you a really short history lesson, JavaScript was created by Netscape for their browser they called Navigator, so Netscape Navigator. This was back in the late 90s, I believe. We can look that up on Wikipedia, but late 90s we've got Netscape, and Netscape is creating the first, or one of the first, visual browsers for HTML web pages on the internet back when the internet stopped being a tool for universities and the military and became a tool for the general population. So Netscape built Navigator, and inside of Navigator, they found that HTML documents were pretty bland. There really wasn't much you could do with them besides just display a document, which is, what it was created for. But everybody was used to all the new GUI, or graphical user interface applications that were running on their computers, just like this, right? We've got Adobe, we've got ourselves an interactive application right here that we can use, right? So with this introduction of graphical user interfaces, and you can see how just everything is dynamic, right? I can click on stuff and you've got everything sliding up and down, and it just feels interactive. Well, web pages were not interactive. Web pages were static. It was just text on a screen that you could read. And Netscape wanted to make the internet more interactive. So they created a scripting language that would run inside of the browser. So if we take Chrome right here, we look at this. So inside of the browser, inside of a window right here where the HTML is running, if we go to a page, so let's go to Neumont's page, we would have all of this content, all of this text that was laid out by the HTML structure, and it's just static. Like this slider that just happened, you wouldn't see anything like that in the early days of the internet until Netscape created JavaScript. And what they did is they created what was called ECMAScript or ECMA script, and they created a kind of an outline of what the scripting language should be for a browser in order to make it interactive. And that became what we call JavaScript. JavaScript is the implementation of ECMA or ECMAScript that was set up by Netscape. So with that little bit of a historic understanding of JavaScript and the browser and how it came to be, the real power of JavaScript, or the most common power of JavaScript, is its ability to manipulate what is in the browser. So what does it mean to manipulate what is in the browser? Well, let's go through this diagram really quick. I'm going to zoom in really close here so we can see in detail. All right, so the browser. The browser is an application that runs on your computer. You're all used to it, like Chrome, Internet Explorer, Safari, and there's a bunch of others like Firefox. And so what the browser does is it requests HTML from a web server, and we won't get into how all that works right now, but it requests the HTML from a web browser, from a web server into the browser. The browser takes the HTML and then it pulls it into itself, and then it has an engine that knows how to parse the HTML structure. Now if we go to our HTML and we take a look at this, we understand that it is a structure, right? It holds the structure of a document and defines what the structure of a document should be that gets sent across the internet. That's really all it is, right? Hypertext markup language. So it defines the structure of a document that gets sent across the internet. And so a browser has to have a way to parse all of this. It has to know how to understand what a tag is, what an element is, what an attribute of an element is, what the values of an attribute is, and the hierarchy that these elements live in. As you can tell by looking at a HTML document, we've got a hierarchy. We've got outer nodes or elements. We've got inner elements. We've got elements that are at the same level. And then we've got inner elements. And then, of course, we can get even further with more elements inside of other elements. And we see that all the time in our HTML structure. So a browser has to know how to parse that. And so as it parses that HTML document or that text, because that's all it really is, it has to create a representation of that text that can be understood by the browser and can be rendered for the user and give us something like this. And that is done by the browser interpreting that HTML document and creating this digital representation. Now, what we call that digital representation is the document object model, or the DOM. And you'll hear that referred to a lot as you go through JavaScript documentation, as you learn more about HTML and CSS. So the DOM, or the document object model, is this virtual or digital representation of an HTML page. So I went ahead and I took this document right here that I created, the one that's inside of our sample project that you just unzipped, and I went ahead and showed how this HTML structure gets parsed by the browser and becomes a virtual set or a virtual tree of nodes based on the structural definition that the HTML file provides us. If we look at this, we'll see that we've got our HTML, which is the root element inside of our DOM. We'll see that we've got the head and the body, which both sit at the same level under the HTML tag. So they become children in this tree nested under the HTML. And then same goes for all the other tags that sit underneath those two tags. So in the head, we usually have a title. We've got metadata tags that talk about what the document has in it. We've got links to style sheets, and we've got script tags that pull in JavaScript. And so usually that's what our head is combined of, and you can see that they all become children or child elements of the head tag. So they are nested under the head. Then we've got ourselves our body, and in here I've got 3 sections. We've got our header, our intro, and our data. And so we've got 3 sections right here. And then you'll notice down here at the bottom I have another JavaScript file that's getting pulled in the body. I wanted to show that because a lot of times people that are new to web development don't realize that you can pull in JavaScript in the head, but you can also pull JavaScript in the body. So that's very useful, and we'll learn more about that in the future. And then, of course, each of these sections have their own nested child elements. In the header, we have a primary nav that is made up of an unordered list with all of its list items. And in those list items, we have anchor tags or link tags that send us to another HTML page or bring us back to this one. So anchor tags, they're the ones that create the links that we see in our page. And then we have an H1, so a header, and then a paragraph inside of our intro. And then our third section has a lot of elements in it because we have a data table, or a table that holds data. And in this table, we're using the head to show all of our header column and our header row. And then we've got our body, which holds all of the rows and columns that hold our data. And then we have our footer that has footer type information. In this case, it's the count of the number of people we have in our data table, and then an average age for those people because we're storing the name and age. So this is a simple example of an HTML document and structure, and then this is an example of how that document gets parsed and turns into the document object model inside of the browser. Now, the DOM, when we're in the browser, is referred to as the document, and we actually are provided an object in JavaScript called document that lets us interact with the entire digital DOM, or the digital representation of the HTML. Now, as a browser parses through the HTML, so it starts at the top and it reads left to right just like we do, but as it runs into things like this style sheet, what it's going to do is it's going to make a request out to the server for that resource, because it's a whole nother file sitting on the web server. When it calls for that resource, it's going to go ahead and make that request, and it's going to wait for that resource to come back. Same thing happens with JavaScript. And so we're not going to focus on CSS right now, but know that CSS is another file on the server, and it gets pulled in as the HTML document gets parsed by the browser. Same thing happens with JavaScript, and here in our example, we will see that as the head gets parsed and these elements begin to get created, when it runs into the script tag, it will run into this source attribute right here that tells it to go ask the web server for this particular file. So what will happen is the browser will make a request out to the web server, and then it will wait for that JavaScript to come back. When that JavaScript comes back, as I've got right here, what will happen is the browser will then pull in that JavaScript and interpret it through the JavaScript engine that the browser has. In our case, we're using Chrome, and Chrome uses what's called the V8 JavaScript engine. And when it does that, it parses that text document, because all this really is a text document, as we've seen in all of our examples so far. It'll parse that text in and then actually create the JavaScript functions in the JavaScript engine that we can then call and use as we manipulate the document or as the user interacts with the document. So what makes JavaScript the tool that makes HTML more interactive is the fact that the JavaScript functions that get interpreted by the browser from the JavaScript we get back from the server, that JavaScript has the ability to ask the DOM for elements, either a specific element or multiple elements. And when it asks for those elements, those elements then get returned back to whatever JavaScript called for it. And those JavaScript functions may have, let's say they called for this h1 tag down here in the second section. Well, the DOM is going to return a reference to that h1. Let's walk through that really quick. The JavaScript function asks the DOM for an element. Let's say that it is asking for this h1 right down here. So JavaScript asks for the h1. The DOM will go through its structure. It'll start at the HTML tag. It'll go to the head. It'll look for the h1. Can't find it. It'll go to the body. Then it'll start going through every single one of its child elements one at a time, and it'll go down through their structure, through their tree, looking for whatever element is that was requested. So in this case, we already went through the head and we went through each of its elements, couldn't find it, so it traverses back up to the HTML. Then it goes to the next sibling element or child element of HTML, which is the sibling of the head that we were just in. Then it goes down to the first child element, and then it goes down through its tree looking for the h1, can't find it, so it rolls right back up, goes to the next child element, and then it starts going through them. Well, it locates the h1. Now, once it locates the h1, what it does is it creates a handle or a reference to that h1, and then it passes that h1 back to the JavaScript function right here. So you can see it comes back, and then the JavaScript function receives a reference to those elements. Once it has those elements, this JavaScript function can do whatever it wants. So over here, it's going to sit and do some work. So it'll be doing all kinds of stuff in here to that HTML element. It could be adding content, removing content, adding child elements, removing child elements. You can do all kinds of stuff to that element. And then once it is done modifying that element, because the reference to that element was provided by the DOM, the JavaScript function is actually manipulating this element directly. And as it manipulates it, all of the manipulations, or every time it is modified, gets sent back to the DOM. And so when the DOM hears that an element within itself has been modified by the JavaScript, what it'll then do is it'll actually notify or send a notification or an update to that JavaScript engine. And the JavaScript engine will then look through the entire DOM, and it'll try to figure out what was modified based on what it was provided as notification as to what was modified. And then it'll go back, and in this case, all we did was modify this h1 right here. So what it's going to do is it's going to go back in here, it's going to go through and modify what was on the screen by re-rendering the DOM in the browser window. And so what we would see, since we modified this h1, is we will see this h1 right here have something happen to it. So it'll either be deleted, or modified. Its text could be changed, or it may be replaced completely with another element. It all depends on what the developer did when they wrote the function that was designed to modify that h1. So, cool thing about JavaScript is it allows us to be super dynamic in the browser. It allows us to do all kinds of stuff on the user's machine in their browser to modify the HTML content. And why this is so powerful, which we haven't talked about yet, is the fact that because this is all, once we receive the JavaScript and everything, all of this stuff is happening on the user's machine. It's not happening on our web server. So all of this work, all of these calculations, all of this computation is happening in the browser on the user's computer. And what this does is it takes a lot of this work of rendering and modifying an HTML page off of our web servers and puts it onto the user's computer. And users usually aren't utilizing the majority of their computational power on their computers. So we're borrowing the user's computational ability, and we're allowing JavaScript to modify and update our documents remotely on the user's machine, rather than making the user request a new compiled page from our web server and doing all of the work on the web server. Now, how we get the content to update a page dynamically and we start to reduce the load across the network, that's some advanced JavaScript that we'll get to later. We are going to focus in these next couple of videos on how we might modify the content in the web page directly and instantly using JavaScript. All right, so hopefully this helps you understand how HTML, the browser, JavaScript, and the virtual DOM all work together. Hopefully this gives you a better understanding of the browsers that you've been using your entire life actually function, and how HTML, JavaScript, CSS, the DOM, the browser, the JavaScript engine, and the rendering engine all work in concert to give us these beautiful web pages that we look at every day and that we use on a daily basis.